Bank have centered these approaches in their policy and financing paradigms. So as a result, we see the focus of states and multilateral institutions have turned to reducing risk to the private sector, often by transferring it to the state and securing insurance mechanisms. This is not only problematic for addressing the inequality between and among nations that is skyrocketing as a result from this pandemic, but it also, and before this pandemic, but it also, it shifts the urgently required attention away from structural reform, particularly in the global debt architecture through a sovereign debt workout mechanism, in tax by establishing a universal intergovernmental process at the UN for international tax cooperation to address illicit financial flows and tax evasion and avoidance by multinational corporations, as well as the regulatory governance of digital economic activities and credit rating agencies. So in this session, we reassess the role of private finance, and we take a clear-eyed look at how the state has been deployed to serve the market through the codification of global rules, norms, and legal protections across international institutions. We are also going to question the notion of resurrecting the developmental state as a state which guides economic development, sets regulations and boundaries for the market, retains ownership of key sectors such as public services, industry, and banking, and uses its resources to prioritize the social and economic rights of people. So here we are in a sea of critical challenges with the multidimensional COVID crises. And we're trying to see also the opportunity of a generation to salvage the broken social contract by reaffirming the centrality of public policies and investments for the objectives of structural transformation in developing country economies and poverty elimination through equality, rights, and justice. So with that, I move to the first speaker, who will be Rajat Bansal. He is a member of the UN Tax Committee. He is the Chief Commissioner of Income Tax at the Ministry of Finance in India and the former competent authority for treaty negotiations. He will speak on the challenges for developing countries with the current international tax system in taxing multinational corporations. I just want to note he cannot stay for the full event. So after Rajat Bansal speaks, we will open up Q&A after his presentation. Following Rajat Bansal will be Ms. Penny Dewi Herasati from Indonesia, and I will introduce her before she speaks. The third in the lineup will be Maria Jose Romero, and last but certainly not least will be Richard Cosal Wright. Please post your questions in the chat box as well. Thank you. You have the floor, Rajat Bansal.
Thank you, Bhumika. Thanks for inviting me to this event. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, perfectly.
Thanks very much. And thanks for organizing this timely event on a very contemporaneous-ish topic from the point of view of developing countries. The developing countries, as we all know, have to rely on domestic resource mobilization for development. And that was what was said in the Addis Ababa conference. And domestic resource mobilization essentially involves raising revenue, raising resources from within, and that brings us to the importance of tax revenue. And the present globalization means that multinational enterprises are involved in the economic lives of developing countries to a great deal. And therefore, a substantial amount of revenue is actually, the economic activity involves multinational enterprises, and as a natural corollary, it would be anybody's expectation that they would be contributing to the domestic resource mobilization in terms of taxes. The taxation of multinational enterprises is governed by the domestic laws as well as by tax treaties. And tax treaties are primarily to alleviate double taxation so that the income is not taxed twice. Firstly in the country from where they come from and the country where this income is derived. apart from the elimination of double taxation, tax treaties also provide for allocation of taxing rights between the two countries. And therefore, it's very important as to how much allocation is done to the source countries, or in this, and we can take them as developing countries uh, under the tax treaties, which will then decide how much share do they get out of this. Now, tax treaties are modeled on international accepted principles, and there are models of double taxation avoidance agreements or bilateral tax treaties. Two most important and well-known models being the OECD Model Convention and the UN Model Convention. These models have a kind of norm-setting role, and depending on these models, tax treaties are negotiated between countries, and then they govern the taxation of multinational enterprises. OECD model, it has been always having a tilt towards the capital exporting countries, and their emphasis has been to provide the taxing rights to the residence countries or the countries from which the multinational enterprises or the foreign companies come from. Whereas the United Nations Model Tax Convention is considered to be a model for negotiation between developing and developed countries, and its emphasis has been to also provide taxing rights to source countries or developing countries. The United Nations Model Convention is designed, or is a creation of United Nations Tax Committee, of which I am also a member, and these members act in their personal capacity or expert capacity rather than representing their governments. And that is how it has been. And that is one aspect that is being debated, that whether it should be an intergovernmental committee, and G77 and some other prominent countries have been requesting for converting it to intergovernmental committee. But for now, it functions as a committee of experts, and the model, all the work is done by these experts acting in their personal capacity. Now, the committee comprises 25 members, and 25 members are selected by the United Nations Under Secretary General for a term of 4 years. The present committee's term is going to end very soon, and these members are generally taken as per geographical representation of all regions, and include members from developing countries as well as developed countries. So you can imagine that when the matters are discussed here, even though the experts are supposedly from in their personal capacity, but they do carry the legacy of their own countries from where they come from. And therefore, the decision-making process in the committee, which is by majority, let me tell you, it's not by consensus. The decision-making process is by majority. So as compared to a consensus-based approach, it is easier here. But as I was saying, the members are from OECD countries, from the developed countries, and they do, even though the committee has the mandate to act with the interest of developing countries, they do carry what should I call it? They do carry their impressions or their experience, or I should say even loyalty to the countries from which they come from. And it's extremely difficult process in the UN committee also to get through anything which is changing the allocation of taxing rights. And understandably so, under the present structure, that is how it is. Now, let me tell you, still, despite all these constraints, the present committee has done something very significant and very important for the interest of developing countries, and three main proposals that have kind of gone through or are in the process of discussion and finalization concerning allocation of taxing rights are: firstly, taxation of digital economy; secondly, taxation of software payments as royalties; and third one is indirect transfers or where some assets situated in a developing country are transferred through a corporate structure situated in an outside jurisdiction, and no capital gains taxes are paid in that country. So the third one has already got approved, and first two are in the process of almost finalization. We don't know how many, whether we'll be successful in all of these. But let me tell you about the digital economy taxation, the most important topic ever in the history of international taxation, which is under a great deal of discussion globally. So OECD and the inclusive framework were working on this. Very briefly, the digital economy taxation so far is not possible in the source country or in developing countries, since the current international tax rules are based on physical presence requirement, which is not there in case of digital companies, and therefore at present they are not taxed in the source countries from where they derive their revenue. So OECD and inclusive framework have been working on this for quite some time and came up with a solution called Pillar 1 or unified approach. That approach is in the public domain, and the approach is basically a centralized approach. The United Nations Tax Committee was working simultaneously and observing what was going on in the inclusive framework. And some of the members in the United Nations Tax Committee, including myself, we advocated that we should work independently, because the solution appears to be not exactly in the favor of market economies or developing countries, primarily on two counts. Firstly, it was complex, and secondly, it was not yielding sufficient share of revenue for the developing countries. So therefore, we advocated having our own approach, and an article in the United Nations Model Tax Convention called 12B has been proposed, which is now in public domain in its final shape. And in the session starting on 19th April, that will be put to the approval for the committee. If it is approved, then it will come in the model, and then countries can adopt it in their bilateral tax treaties, and it will give taxing rights to the market jurisdictions over digital economies major segment, what we call automated digital services segment. So this is a very important development and a significant development, which we feel will be a major breakthrough for developing countries in the United Nations Tax Committee. I can go for I can go on and on, but looking at the time, I think I just lastly touch upon the aspect of intergovernmental committee conversion of United Nations Tax Committee. Uh, I have already mentioned about it, but as of now, it is like this only, and there is, it was tried very hard in 2016 or 17. G17 7 countries tried very advocated its conversion very strongly, but it didn't happen. So anyway, I think that as long as it is like this, the present structure is in existence, it's all right, and a lot can be done here also. And that's what the committee, the members in the committee from developing countries have been trying. And I'm happy to say that the results in this committee session have been quite encouraging, and I hope that this continues. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bansal. That was fantastic. Thank you. We're going to open up for questions now, because I know you have to leave in a short while. So all participants can use the chat to ask questions or take the floor. That's fine as well. Please post in there. Okay, so we have a question by Pooja. I'll just read out the question. Thanks, Mr. Bansal. There is a lot of discussion right now about global minimum corporate tax and Pillar 2 of the OECD IF discussions. What are your thoughts on this from a developing country perspective?
Right. So thanks, Pooja, for your question. And the global minimum tax, minimum corporate tax, or Pillar 2 is important. I mean, it checks the distortions in the system. Right now, if suppose some countries do not, what we call, there are jurisdictions which do not have any tax. And therefore, the tendency is for several enterprises to set up structures there and park their income there so that it is not subjected to tax. And then there are several tools that are that come into being to tackle this, and it's quite difficult looking at the information asymmetry and in difficulty in getting the information, and even the legal tools may not be sufficient to tackle this kind of what is, maybe these are abusive structures, so it's not always successful. So as a remedy to that, the idea of global minimum corporate tax has been floated. It was there for quite some time. In fact, in the Forum for Harmful Tax Practices, this was being talked about 3-4 years back when I used to attend those meetings. Now, this is a welcome move, but let me say that this is not a substitute for allocation of taxing rights issue. These two are, I should say, mutually exclusive issues. We should not lose sight that global minimum tax will definitely correct the distortions. But at the same time, the issue of allocation of taxing rights, which is very important for developing countries, is a different issue, and that should not be lost sight of when we pursue the goal of global minimum corporate tax. And there also in the Pillar 2 report, there are proposals of different kind to tackle the global minimum corporate tax. Basically, what they do there is to allow taxing of income which is not taxed anywhere. And there is one proposal to give the taxing right to the country of residence. But the other proposal, I'm not taking the technical names, considering the audience we have. And on other hand, there could be taxing right given to the source country. So the latter could be important from the point of view of developing countries. So I hope that answers your question.
And we have a second question from Laurie Johnston. How is tax regulation enforced? How does this work with efforts for binding international banking regulation? Can tax agreements be enforced without such regulation?
I haven't understood this question fully. Probably if you're referring to information relating to international banking, can you clarify a bit what exactly do you mean by binding international banking regulation? Or let me try to answer it without bothering you further. Probably you mean, as far as I understand, the banking information is something which was not available sometimes earlier, and it's important to have the banking information for the purpose of enforcing tax laws. So, Global Forum on Exchange of Information and Transparency brought in certain international standards, and as per those standards, the tax treaty exchange of information article is to compulsorily have the provision of exchanging banking information. So at the moment, there is focus on banking information maintenance. There is also a focus on or an obligation to maintain banking information and also to exchange it, so that that will help in enforcing the tax agreements. I don't know whether I have been able to answer your question correctly.
Thanks, Mr. Bansal. Just one last question by Tony Salvador. What is the possible intersection with respect to the proposal on digital taxation and the tariff on e-commerce at the WTO, which I believe is currently subject to a moratorium?
Yes. So I'm not fully aware of the latter one, but I do have an idea about it. And I do not see this as to be in conflict. I mean, the digital taxation we are talking about is the taxation of the income from the digital transactions, whereas tariff on e-commerce is an indirect tax, and generally that is paid by the consumer rather than by the service provider. So that is the main difference between the direct and indirect taxation. And the digital taxation we are talking about is a direct taxation, whereas the other one is incidences on a different point.
Thanks, Mr. Bansal. I think if there's no further questions, we'll move to the next speaker in consciousness of time. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bansal. The next speaker is Ms. Penny Devi Herasati, Director of Sociocultural Affairs and International Organization of Developing Countries at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. Ms. Penny Devi Herasati will speak on digital governance and digital divide. She will also have to leave soon after, so we'll follow the same organization of asking questions right after she speaks and then moving to the third speaker. So Ms. Penny Devi Herasati, you have the floor. Are you here?
Thank you, moderator. Thank you.
Welcome,
Thank
welcome.
You. Distinguished participants and colleagues, good morning, New York. Good morning from Jakarta. Good evening. I hope you are well, safe, and healthy wherever you are. First, allow me to thank the Civil Society Financing for Development Group for organizing this virtual side event. I am pleased to participate in this important side event. Today's discussion on the link between FFD and digital governance to curb the digital divide is very timely and indeed highly relevant. The digital divide highlighted the digital inequality that is part of the bigger picture of social, economic, and environmental inequality. It is in a global scale, and the COVID-19 pandemic has manifested and exacerbated those existing inequalities. When we tie in the digital divide with the broader context of inequality, digital governance serves a crucial purpose, and that is to facilitate access, which in turn addresses injustice. Digital governance should promote digital transformation via the development of hard and soft infrastructure, which includes expanding the mobile and fixed broadband networks, as well as developing digital literacy and skills. Digital transformations opens tremendous possibilities for the pandemic recovery and the achievements of the 2030 agenda. Post-pandemic, governments are looking to digital technology to reboot their economies. They are relying on the digital economy to develop stability and people's confidence in the economy to boost growth. On that note, allow me to share a few points on how we could address this digital gap. First, promote universal, secure, reliable, and affordable connectivity. Governments, with the support of the private sector and relevant stakeholders, hold a key role for ICT infrastructure to expand affordable access to the fastest and broadest possible service. While in the past few years, internet access in the developing countries has been growing, it is still too slow and expensive. Without affordable access, advances in digital technologies disproportionately benefit those already connected, contributing to greater inequality. Second, broaden people access to the ICTs, including computers and mobile telephones. Connectivity goes hand in hand with access to the appropriate devices that everyone can afford, which optimizes the benefits deriving from current digital era. Third, advanced capacity building and digital literacy for all. Lack of ICT skills is a significant barrier in ensuring the effective use of existing and new technologies. We shall improve the digital capacities and literacy of all, including women, local communities, and rural population. Fourth, we must strengthen security, safety, and trust towards digital platforms. As people dependence towards digital tools increase, the risk of misuse of ICT applications are even higher. In this context, we need to minimize the risk of the use of ICT through the balance between human rights, security, and development, and in accordance with national regulations and laws. Fifth, the context of digital transformation, the digital infrastructure in place has to be utilized with proper digital applications. Therefore, we need to support the development of digital applications, including community-based application developers. As a member of the ITU Council, Indonesia strives to increase equal access to internet for all, encourage multi-stakeholders cooperation, as well as to accelerate digital transformation. To summarize, digital governance to curb the digital gap will have a key role in pandemic recovery and in addressing inequalities. However, digital governance should not be done in a vacuum. Pandemic recovery and addressing inequality require complex measures based on cross-sectoral integrated policies. It is imperative to intersect digital governance with FFD to optimize recovery and reach stability. Distinguished participants and colleagues, as mentioned by the moderator, unfortunately, I would have to leave this discussion early. Once again, I wish to thank the Civil Society Financing for Development Group for inviting me, and I apologize for not being able to participate throughout the whole discussion. I wish all of you a constructive and successful side event. Thank you. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you for sharing with us on the digital divide and the necessary governance. I just want to ask if there's any questions to put it in the chat, please. Alternately, you can also do the raise hand function in the Zoom.
Ms. Muchala.
Doesn't look like we
Yeah,
have questions.
Yeah, I really have to go. I
Okay.
have another Zoom meeting going on.
Great.
I wish I'll see if this meeting finishes early, then I will come back and join the discussion probably towards the end of the meeting.
Great, that would be great if you could do that. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your time. And I'll leave you to your other meeting now.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish I can come back later on. Thank you, see you, bye.
Okay, thanks, bye. Okay, so we will move on to our third speaker, and now we will have both speakers turn by turn before opening up the floor in a more holistic way. Our next speaker is Maria Jose Romero, who is Policy and Advocacy Manager on Publicly Backed Private Finance at the European Network on Debt and Development. Maria Jose, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bhumika. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Bhumika said, the title of this session is COVID response and private sector, incentives, regulations, or systemic reforms, question mark. And I would like to approach this very complex and broad topic from the point of view of the increasing role of private finance in development. And I hope that this complements what other speakers have said and gives a chance to get into a discussion later on. My points will address three main issues. The first one, it's the implication of an agenda that places a strong focus on private finance in the context of development. Second, some reflections from the experience with the use of public-private partnerships for delivering infrastructure and social services, which I think that are particularly relevant in the context of the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic. And third, and to conclude, I would share some ideas for an alternative approach, also in line with the title of this session. As a background, I would say that the pandemic has exposed the consequences of decades of austerity policies and privatization strategies that have undermined public health systems and progress on universal social protection. It has also exacerbated pre-existing failures of systemic nature. And as a result of the COVID crisis, there has been calls for ambitious responses, both in terms of scale and policies, under the broad headline of building back better or rebuilding better. But in many cases, there is no critical discussion on what these slogans actually mean. And this week, today we are kicking off the week of the Financing for Development Forum. This week is a very important opportunity to advance on this collective thinking and to show the high level of ambition that is urgently needed. And now going to address my first point. And for that, I think that it's very important to understand that over the last decade, there has been significant changes in development finance, in the development finance landscape. The prevailing narrative, as also Bhumika mentioned at the beginning, calls for an agenda that heavily rests on using public money, including official development assistance, and public institutions, mainly development banks, multilateral development banks, to leverage private finance. The objective is to attract the trillions of dollars managed by private institutional investors to help finance the sustainable development goals. And this agenda implies a strong focus on de-risking private finance. And the issue of risk was a special topic in the latest interagency task force report on financing sustainable development. This means that changing investment climate, both globally and at national level, it's one of the main instruments to this de-risking objective that is foreseen. The idea is to give more favorable conditions to private investors and also to alter risk-rewards calculations by providing subsidies, guarantees, and various other risk mitigation instruments. Public-private partnerships in its different forms and blended finance are some of the instruments promoted. Importantly, this is not just an infrastructure agenda. It's an agenda for how public services have to be financed. It is about creating market in a more systematic way. And behind all this is the assumption that developing countries and particular sectors are not ready to attract private investment as they should be. While private investors might bring additional resources that are much needed to deliver on the SDGs, it is critical to look at the broader implications of this agenda and civil society had been raising some of these implications for many years now, and I will get into them. First, incentivizing private investment at the scale may in fact be undermining public policy objectives aimed at sustainable development in the global south, eroding the role and capacity of the state to provide public services vital to ensuring human rights, development, and climate resilience, and leaving countries more vulnerable to that crisis. This agenda also has important repercussions for how we define the role of the state. And this is also a point that Bhumika raised at the beginning. In most cases, the state is defined by its capacity to provide business-friendly regulations and facilitate private profit by carrying the risks that private investors are not ready to take, instead of by its capacity to guarantee the fulfillment of human rights. Moreover, it's clear that this has also implications for democratic accountability, as private actors are mainly accountable to their shareholders and not to the citizens. Given all this, it is important to think about private finance and the role of the state from a development perspective. And as I said, this week is particularly important for that. Now turning to my second point, and this is about the implications of using particular instruments, in this case, the use of public-private partnership. And as I said, I think that it's very important to have this conversation in the context of the recovery of the pandemic, as there is a high risk of deepening fiscal austerity and intensifying the private turn to investment as soon as fiscal stimulus in response to lockdown are over. This is not only an agenda heavily promoted by the World Bank Group. This is an agenda that has permeated the policies and practices of different multilateral development institutions and bilateral donors. So it's not just something that we are seeing as part of the maximizing finance for development agenda of the bank. It's almost promoted, PPPs are a practice promoted across the board at this point. However, there is a growing body of evidence about problematic PPP projects in both developed and developing countries. And I would like to bring just 4 points into today's discussion. The first one is that PPP projects tend to be more expensive than publicly financed projects due to high cost of private finance, profit margins, and transaction costs. In developing countries, the returns required by investors are higher due to higher perceived risks. 2, PPPs effectively delay budget expenditures and do not lower the fiscal impacts of projects. The true cost of PPP project is often unknown, as operations are recorded off balance sheet and they frequently lack transparency and scrutiny. Number 3 is that PPPs are usually a risky business for the public sector and hence for citizens. Non-transparent contingent liabilities are a great risk, and PPP projects can therefore be a source of debt in countries that are already at high risk of debt distress. There are many different examples that can account for this, and one of the most well-known examples in the Global South is the PPP hospital in Lesotho, in the capital of Lesotho. Is a project supported by the World Bank that has had significant adverse and unpredictable financial consequences on public funds. And number 4, in relation to the problematic aspects of PPPs, is that the promotion of PPPs or the reliance on PPPs can shift public sector investment priorities, which can have a detrimental effect on women and the most vulnerable. Having a strong focus on identifying profitable projects limits the extent to which PPPs can proceed in areas which are at first not profitable. Having said that, I would like to conclude with some reflections on what could be an alternative approach if we were to ensure alignment of and participation by the private sector in a development agenda focused on a fair recovery from COVID-19 and on tackling the challenges of socio-economic transformation of developing countries, which we assume that has to be at the core of our discussions. Private finance as a source of financing for development needs to be downgraded, given the evidence of its failure to effectively contribute to sustainable development. Greater attention is needed to more effective and sustainable means to expand fiscal space, including meeting official development assistance commitments and preserving its quality, tackling tax avoidance and evasion by multinational companies, and an immediate cancellation of debt payments linked to a more comprehensive approach to debt crisis resolution under the auspices of the United Nations. And some concrete proposals for what can be done that has been at the core of civil society work in recent years include first, examining the actual developmental and poverty reduction impacts of blended finance and PPP projects. We think that this is key before expanding the use of these instruments even further. When it comes to ODA, there is a risk of waiting very scarce resources subsidizing private investment. Another very concrete proposal, and I will close with that, is the fact of promoting domestic regulation of finance and domestic measures against volatile capital flows, rather than compelling countries to increase their exposure to global financial instability. So having said all this, and looking forward to the conversation, I would like just to restate some of the concepts that we have mentioned several times in this year of the pandemic. From a civil society point of view, we think that in order to effectively and equitably deal with the current crisis, business as usual is not an option. Thank you very much, Bhumika.
Thank you, Maria Jose. That was very important to understand the landscape of private finance, and especially some of the key recommendations, especially on domestic regulation and public development banks. I would love to introduce Richard Cosal Wright, who many of you know, Director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development based in Geneva. Richard, the floor is yours.
Bhumika, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. I don't have a lot to add to what other people have said, really. Just some reflections, I guess. Partly coming out of the IMF World Bank meetings last week, which I guess many of you followed, and the kind of slightly schizophrenic discussion that took place at those meetings, which on the one hand was increasingly optimistic about the state of the global economy, largely due to a very rosy interpretation of US prospects, which partly are justified, but we feel are slightly overdone, but there are important changes there that should not be underestimated. At the same time, a lot of talk about divergence, both within countries and across countries, and for us particularly concerns that developing countries are going to face an increasingly difficult time over the coming decade or so, and talk of a lost decade was raised. We raised it in the Trade and Development Report last year, if things don't change. And I guess at the heart of that, at the heart of both the optimism and the pessimism, in a way, is this question of resource mobilization. And the sudden discovery in the advanced economies that they have a lot more fiscal space than they've believed in the past, and we know the amounts of resources that have been mobilized in the advanced economies in response to the crisis on the one hand, and at the same time a recognition that fiscal space in many developing countries has been squeezed even more tightly by the consequences of COVID-19, and that poses very serious problems for many of them going forward. And I guess at the at the heart of this story is the model of development that colleagues of Maria and others have talked about this view of I guess I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea that it's a world that is divided between finance and the real economy. I think that's a misleading dichotomy often in these discussions. But there's a belief in private finance that includes private credit as a source of mobilization, and of course private profits as part of that resource mobilization story, and that somehow that by boosting both access to credit and boosting profits, then that will almost automatically translate into higher levels of productive investment, so long as you leave markets and competition to ensure that allocation is done effectively, and that rules and regulations are put in place at the international level, essentially to stop governments interfering with that allocation process. And I guess it's maybe appropriate on the day after John Williamson died that we've seen the kind of morphing of the Washington consensus of the 80s and 90s into what Daniela Gabor calls the Wall Street consensus, and that Maria Jose gave a presentation on previously. So this is the great irony, I think, of this kind of story that is peddled endlessly is that over the last 20, 30 years, with one or two very notable exceptions, despite the fact that we have moved into a world in which private credit creation and private profits have been boosted, thanks to the advent of neoliberal policies, investment has not followed suit. At least capital formation has not happened in the way that economists think about investment as the boosting of capacity at the productive level. And so we have this weird disconnect in a way between the support for private resource mobilization on the one hand, and the failure of that to do what it promises, which is to deliver a strong investment climate that will boost productivity growth, will raise incomes, will create more demand in a kind of virtuous free market story, which is at the root of this kind of ideology. And so, and all the concerns that Maria Jose just raised about some of the techniques that are used to animate this model have clearly failed in terms of its basic justification. And its basic justification is to deliver private productive investment. And the exceptions to this story, I mean, with the most obvious one being China, have done so by quite overtly not following those rules of the game. They've gone back to a set of traditional policy instruments, which the ideology itself says are detrimental to any sort of sustained developmental model, right? They use public credit institutions, they regulate finance heavily, including the inflows of private capital. They use industrial policy extensively as the way to not only mobilize the necessary resources, but to channel those resources in a way that creates jobs, that builds up a more diversified industrial structure, that leads to technological upgrading, etc. So we have this funny world where the success stories have clearly broken the rules of the game, at the same time that despite the record, there is a constant attempt to push further forward this agenda of financialization, liberalization, etc. Now, the big question that we ask ourselves in response to this is whether the recent response to COVID-19, and it's been an important one, particularly in the US, marks a genuine change of course, which will have ramifications at the international level, and people look at the SDR allocation as being an extension of a kind of new approach to resource mobilization, as an indication that we're moving in a new direction, or whether other features of the system, such as the pitiful response to the debt crisis, the DSSI, and other initiatives have clearly a clear indication that we haven't broken with the past model, as to some extent is the reaction of the advanced economies to the calls for developing countries to waive IPR rights on COVID-19 related patents, as again an indication that we haven't broken with the traditional model. So at least what we are, I mean, there are, so it's a glass, I guess is it the glass half full or is the glass half empty? And I guess we think it's a bit of both, but I think it's important to kind of try and leverage the inconsistency that we now see in the narrative that is coming out of COVID-19 to push that in a more progressive direction. So the United States cannot do what Biden wants to do without industrial policy. That's just very clear. Now, he can't do industrial policy in the WTO. He can't do the kind of industrial policy he wants to do in the WTO, and certainly not when you put the climate story on top of the economic story. So there's a real opportunity, I think, there for progressives to push on that kind of inconsistency and make a progressive case for reform of the WTO that is linked to a more inclusive and sustainable development model. And I think the same is true of the international financial system as well. I mean, the SD, we've argued now for some time in UNCTAD that the $650 billion allocation, while historically unprecedented, is still not enough given the kind of liquidity constraints that many developing countries are facing at the moment. But it's not, I mean, the problem goes beyond that. It's not a liquidity crisis that many developing countries face. It's a solvency crisis, and you don't solve solvency problems with liquidity instruments. You need debt relief, you need a restructuring, you need an institution that is independent of creditors to be able to do that in a fair and fast and efficient fashion. So, and that's to some extent a conversation that I think has been opened up by the response to COVID-19, and it's very important that civil society, I think, keeps pushing on that pedal and gets more traction in moving the institutions in that direction. So I think, you know, I think it went. My reaction to the bank fund meetings, and it was funny because a lot of people listening to it said, oh, look, UNCTAD has been vindicated by the way in which the conversation has shifted in Washington over the last few months. And whilst that sounds nice, and it's nice to be patted on the back now and again, I suspect that is a somewhat simplistic reading of things at the policy level coming out of Washington and the advanced economies, Brussels in particular. But there are opportunities there I think we need to exploit and to push further, not just in terms of criticizing some of these issues, but trying to really put forward a positive agenda that brings trade, finance, industrial development together in a more integrated manner that can genuinely deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and other development goals. So basically, that's my reflections, Bhumika.
Thanks, Richard. That was fantastic. A lot of different points coming out. I want to open the floor for questions. Again, please post in the chat box or take the floor. There is a raise hand function in the Zoom that you can use as well. So let me give the floor to Ambassador Carazo. Ambassador, take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here with you today and to talk on these issues from different angles, or from angles that are different to the common talk, the common conversation, and the common assumptions that lead the discussions, and have led them for over a year now. Let me say that Costa Rica and many other developing countries are hurting, not the country, the populations. The populations are hurting due to the lack of basic funds to provide for the economic and social rights which the population is entitled to. And that means poverty. There's millions of people around the world going into poverty without their countries being able to provide the necessary support. Stimulus is called in the North for those populations to survive, to take home some money, some food, to stop the way into poverty, to have some support for small businesses or informal businesses, which make the living for so many people every day. So there's none of that funds. The conversation goes on towards the debt alleviation, and the debt alleviation is an insurance, an assurance to the creditor banks that the debtor countries would have the resources to pay to them. So as long as we look into the debt issue, the debt architecture, even the debt alleviation, that means that we're looking into the interests of the lenders and not into the interests of the people. We in our countries need fiscal space, need resources to cover the needs of the population. The Secretary General of the United Nations sensed the solution very soon. A massive transfer of resources from the north to the south. So massive that would be 10% of the GDP of the countries, of the developing countries. And there's no problem with that amount in the north. Money is abundant, resources are abundant, the liquidity is abundant. So transfer from one side of the world to the other side as a loan, 50-year loan with prevailing interest rates, which are basically nil at this moment, and no conditionality other than the funds be assigned to provide for the SDGs, to alleviate the population in the LDGs, SDGs components. That is the only conditionality that would be into these loans, which are to be made through the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and the Regional Bank. Without them charging any fee for the negotiations, and of course with due accounting, and also with the countries following, on the other hand, all the prescription for the rest of the loans or the debts, all the prescriptions and all the limitations, all the conditionality of the World Bank, of the IMF, and so on. Be good managers of their economies, while also tending to the people, which is the most important issue. I mean, the people are going worse, the people are having more needs, that's having economic effects, that is having social effects, and that is having also political effects. It's also in the interest of the countries of the North that not many millions of people come into illegal migrations with the drug trafficking and all the ills that this situation could bring into the so-called developed economies. So we aspire for that massive transfer of funds, 3% of the GDP, which is only a fraction of the $20 trillion $20 trillion that are being developed, and rightly so, for stimulus in these economies. Let's have a bit of that raised in the markets of the North, go to the South with these purposes. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador Carazo, especially for presenting the FACE proposal from Costa Rica. It's incredibly important, especially at this time with the massive gap in fiscal stimulus between developing countries and developed countries. And the proposal has also been included in the outcome document of the Financing for Development follow-up forum this week, just to note that. I wanted to invite any other questions at this point to any of the speakers, as well as perhaps if you have any brief points to make as well. Yes, Stefano.
Thank you, Bhumika, and thanks to the speakers. I think I'd like to go back to maybe where Richard closed it in some respect, because there is a very great need to reconnect development finance conversation to real economy strategy and real economy measures, you know, and Richard pointed a lot of emphasis on the need for a new set of industrial policy, which of course require a different trade and investment agreement. So it is this reconnection between real economy measures, because we are in the middle of a real economy crisis, with development finance. Now, the question is that we haven't found adequate modalities to do that in the UN context. I mean, the FFD outcome is currently under silent procedures, but I think I provide no surprise to say that we as civil society, we are deeply concerned with the fact that once again, it contains a lot of words, but no actionable outcome. So how can we actually find different modalities in the UN for discussing this reconnection between real economy measures and development finance? How to do that? You know, certainly, I mean, in that context, already winning a strong mandate for UNCTAD in the occasion of the mandate renegotiations, which are currently started, is an important element. But I'm talking in terms of process, because it's clear that the FFD process with these litanic outcome negotiations and the forum itself, independently that the limitations on the COVID modalities is not really proving that. And we continue to kick the idea of a new FFD conference down the road. So what modalities can we find? What is maybe the single first step in which to try to propose a conversation and a discussion on how to reconnect these two dimensions of real economy and development finance? Thank you.
Bhumika, you're muted.
So thanks, Stefano. Sorry about that. It would be great to take at least one more question before turning it to our panelists. And in fact, I might actually take this opportunity myself. I would like to address, the role of credit rating agencies in terms of the regulatory sphere. We have seen how credit rating agencies in this crisis have played an incredibly influential role with many countries have decided not to request a suspension from bilateral and particularly private creditors because of their fear and anxiety of the negative impact of getting a credit rating downgrade. And we see also the self-fulfilling prophecy effect of these downgrades, that even countries that have strong fundamentals, once downgraded, experience that kind of cyclical deterioration. So we have so many different problems outlined by the independent expert on debt and human rights in her recent report, as well as a civil society submission on some of the issues ranging from monopoly power, conflicts of interest, and moral hazard. So I'd especially like to ask Richard on to address the dilemma of credit rating agencies, prospects of regulation, and specifically ideas around creating public credit rating agencies that have been proposed by ECLAC and Alicia Barcena. We can turn it over to Richard, and then also we have, I believe Ms. Herasati is back from her previous meeting, and also Maria Jose. So if we can take turns with the three panelists we have, that would be fantastic. Any other questions, please either raise your hand and I'll try to catch a raised hand, or post in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay, Bhumika. Let me just begin with Ambassador Carazo's point, because as he knows, we have in UNCTAD promoted the idea of a kind of global Marshall Plan, which is, I think, very similar to what he's talking about. And of course, you come up when you talk about the Marshall Plan. There are a couple of things that immediately come up. I mean, it was a very significant injection of resources into the global economy, of course, that's true, although it was focused on Europe. People sometimes forget, though, it was actually dwarfed 2 years later by the amount of money the US pumped into the global economy through the Korean War. Look, I mean, the spending on the Korean War was something like 6 times as great as the Marshall Plan. And now, what that tells you is that first of all, there were a lot of resources to be mobilized in the US that could serve an international agenda. They were, in my opinion, of course, misdirected in terms of using that for destructive rather than creative purposes. But there was no shortage of resources after the war, even from the one country that really, it was only a one-country model. The European countries were still rebuilding. I think, but I mean, and this is, I guess, speaks to Stefano's point a little bit too. Behind that was a very different set of domestic rules of the game. If I want to solve the problems of insecurity, indebtedness, and insufficient investment, we have a model in a way for that. This was the model that emerged at the end of the Second World War, right? You have strong labor unions, you have progressive rates of taxation, and you have rules and regulations that make it difficult for private profits to be channeled into speculative financial activities, and which makes it sensible for them to invest in productive activities that boosts productivity, that allows them to meet the wage demands that come from having strong trade unions. I mean, that was the model. And so when we, for example, promote the idea of a global Green New Deal, or a Green New Deal, and as people do in the United States, and say, well, this is way too ambitious. You're looking at a wartime economy. You need the kind of mobilization structures that were typical of World War II. The answer to that is no. What you want are the kind of structures that were actually in place for 30 years after the end of the Second World War, which were to some extent democratic and based on a mixed economy model. There were lots of other problems with that model, but the ability of it to generate the kind of resources that we're talking about to meet the SDGs and related problems were not one of them. So you know, underpinning this whole discussion of how we reconnect this kind of netherworld of hyperglobalized finance with the demands of improving the lives of people is this need to seriously talk about the rules of the game that structure economic and social relationships more generally. I think we have to be honest about that. You know, you can't wave your hand and say, wow, if the UN was a slightly more effective organization, somehow that we could make this reconnect in some way. I wish it was true working in one of those institutions, but I don't think it is. I mean, I think there's a very serious set of systemic issues and that bias the system in certain ways that need to be tackled. So it's always the case, I think, that if you're talking about a serious international agenda, you have to connect it to a serious domestic agenda as well, because the two are mutually supportive of each other. So you know, I mean, for Stefano, yeah, I mean, UNCTAD 15 is coming up. Will these be the issues in UNCTAD 15? Yes. Do we need support from civil society? Yes. Will the European Union be working against this agenda? Yes. And we need to counter that. That's just a fact. All those things are true. But behind this, we need to connect a progressive international agenda to a progressive domestic agenda, particularly in the advanced economies. I mean, ultimately, this hinges on whether the advanced economies behave properly or not. And we have to take some positives from what Biden has done in his first 100 days. You know, I didn't expect it. And I think there's things there we need to build on. Sadly, the European Union are not following suit, and Japan is not following suit. But you know, I think you have to take some optimism from that. And speaking to Bhumika's issue about you know these problematic institutions that are not part of the multilateral world that structure the way in which finance is mobilized and delivered. You know, yeah, I mean, you know, we're arguing for a global public debt or global debt authority. Just and I would have. It's not something we've worked on. I know ECLAC are working on it more systematically. Some kind of equivalent for credit rating agencies would be the natural analog of that kind of institutional reform that we are proposing at the debt level. And I think the more work that, I mean, we are advancing the idea of a global public debt authority. We will put something out on that in the next couple of weeks. So I hope that it complements what the people in ECLAC are doing, because clearly you need systematic reform to the financial architecture if we're going to deliver the kind of investment agenda that we think is necessary to underpin the Sustainable Development Goals and address the climate problem. So yeah, I mean, you know, the more the merrier, basically.
Thanks, Richard. We look forward to receiving UNCTAD's proposals on a public rating agency. That will be really interesting. I wanted to see if Maria Jose wanted to come in before opening the floor to more questions.
Yeah, thanks, Bhumika. I think that we are having a very interesting conversation. And as I said, today we are in the first day of the Financing for Development Forum, and it's the right place to be having these conversations. From a civil society point of view, we certainly agree with some of the points that Richard put on the table. And it seems clear that both the G20 and the Bretton Woods institutions are not up to the task of delivering in terms of the level of ambition that is needed at this point and the type of systemic reforms that are needed to deal with the crisis. And they also lack democratic legitimacy to do that. And this is why, since the outbreak of the current crisis, civil society organizations have been calling for a new financing for development conference, Monterrey plus 20 type of conference, where the issues of global economic architecture reform can be substantively addressed. Unfortunately, it's quite likely that this week we are not going to see a call for this conference to take place, as government might be postponing the consideration of this conference once again, which is a real disappointment. On this, we will certainly keep pushing. I mean, we will certainly have our efforts to insist on the need for this conference to take place. And in terms of UNCTAD 15, for sure, we need UNCTAD with a strong mandate to address some of the points that Richard put on the table. There are clear needs in the current time to discuss and address an investment agenda that works for sustainable development and also address and put at the center the type of institutions that work for that purpose. And here I want to make a connection to one of the points that Richard mentioned, which is about the access to credit. There is a belief that this will happen through the private sector, right? Through large commercial private banks, and in that way, micro, small, and medium enterprises in developing countries will get the resources that they need. But of course, this has been quite problematic. So I would. This is calling for a strong role of well-governed and well-resourced public national development banks, as they may offer cheaper and more equitable means of channeling finance, including to small and medium enterprises, but they have to serve the public interest and public policy objectives. And this is not what we are getting at the moment. So I will conclude in that way, and we can get more in the coming days. Thank you.
And just a last question from Pooja. It's in the chat box. She says, can you say more on the Global Debt Authority? I believe this is addressed to Richard. How is Global Debt Authority different from attempts by developing countries in the past to have a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism under the auspices of the UN?
Well, you have to wait for the paper for any sort of detail. I mean, obviously, look, UNCTAD was the first institution at the multilateral level to propose an idea of a sovereign debt workout mechanism in response to the Latin American debt crisis of the early 1980s, and we've written and a lot of what we will have to say about a global debt authority will pick up on that work. It was briefly picked up by the IMF in the early 2000s, eventually slapped down by the US at that time. So, I mean, there is as you say, there is a precedent for this, and it's not simply about reinventing the wheel here. I don't think we've ever argued that it should necessarily be a UN organization, at least within the family of the UN. You know, that may not be the case. You know, it should. The one criteria that we insist on is it shouldn't be within. It shouldn't be part of a creditor organization, which is why we don't think the IMF or the World Bank are appropriate homes for such a body because they are creditors themselves and therefore have a vested interest in certain types of outcome that may not be ideal. So we're not arguing that it has to be a UN agency as such, but it should be a multilateral independent body, and we will kind of try and flesh out some of the details of what might come under the responsibilities of that kind of body in the paper that we'll put out shortly. Just on a kind of last note, I guess, from our perspective. I mean, one thing that I think comes out from the discussion today, is we should never simply talk about the private sector, because clearly there are many different components that make up the private sector, and they're not all operating in the same direction. I mean, Bhumika and others have mentioned, and Mary Jose, the particular problems of small and medium-sized enterprises, which are not necessarily the same as those of large international corporations. So I think as a narrative, it's very important, and firms within the developing world face a whole different set of pressures from firms in the advanced economy. So it is when you're talking about the role of the private sector, it's very important always to keep in mind that it is a very heterogeneous group, and that we need a nuanced discussion in terms of what kind of supports are necessary for different components of that. And I do sometimes worry about civil society, for example, about a certain hostility to scale. I mean, UNCTAD has never been against I'm not against big firms. Big firms are good. They have certain advantages that developing countries would benefit from massively if they could create their own big firms. Their trouble is that they can't. That doesn't mean that scale brings problems. Scale brings problems too. It's why you need countervailing forces to make sure that the power that comes with scale is not used in a predatory or abusive fashion. UNCTAD came up a long time ago with a whole set of rules on restrictive business practices. But you have to have a nuanced view of the private sector if it's to play a constructive role in terms of resource mobilization and meeting the kind of investment goals that we're talking about. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, Richard, for those comments. And indeed, I agree with Iolanda in the chat that we look forward to both the papers on the Global Debt Authority as well as a public rating agency. And just to also reiterate that Stefano mentioned that indeed we need to unpack the private sector taxonomy, and Barry Herman has mentioned that we should keep in mind that governments issue bonds to pay for public investment and private investors buy them, as to the World Bank bonds. And yes, just in closing, that Pooja also said that it's a bit concerning to hear that the argument is that a global debt authority doesn't need to be in the UN, especially if that means a sort of WTO style body. I just want to now say that it's 9:31 and we are at closing time to stick to all the various other demands and activities all of you have. I just want to close with a very quick note that I agree very much with what all of our speakers have said, in particular to have this follow-up forum as a critical moment to advance some of these key systemic proposals, and not doing so would be yet another missed opportunity. So this week is an important platform to advance on this collective thinking, to reassess and reconfigure some of these embedded narratives that have been that have commanded a lot of power and a lot of sway. And we need to show that there is a high level of ambition in this crisis of a generation. And I also wanted to just invoke some of Richard's points around industrial policy, that this is a time to remember also that infant industrial policy and the history of industrial policy is incredibly important. And this is a time where we need to reconfigure what does industrial policy mean in a time of multidimensional systemic crises of health, of human rights, of public services, of climate change, and of intersectional inequalities. So I think with that, I will close. Thank you to all of our speakers. Apologies that some of the speakers had to leave early. And we look forward to working together. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Well,